When the king of cool was finally laid to rest on a chilly December day in 1995, the world noticed a gaping, tuxedo-sized hole in the front pew. Dean Martin was gone, and Frank Sinatra, the man who had been his partner in crime, booze, and brotherhood for decades, was nowhere to be found. The media screamed feud, while fans feared the worst. But the truth wasn't about a grudge. It was about a man finally breaking. The rift. The 1988 tour in 1988. The Rat Pack decided to give the public one last hit of the old magic. It was supposed to be the Together Again tour, a victory lap across America featuring Frank, Dean, and Sammy Davis Jr. on paper. It was the greatest ticket in town. In reality, it was a slow-motion train wreck that nearly demolished the most famous friendship in Hollywood history. The problem was simple. Frank wanted to be a legend, and Dean just wanted to go home and watch westerns. To understand why this tour caused such a rift, you have to understand the headspace of the two men at the time. Frank Sinatra was a man who functioned like a military general. He thrived on the road, the lights, and the discipline of the stage. He viewed the tour as a serious professional obligation, a way to show the world that the chairman of the board still owned the boardroom. Dean Martin, however, was in a very different, much darker place. Just a year earlier, Dean's world had been shattered. His son, Dean Paul Martin, had died in a tragic plane crash while flying for the Air National Guard. Dean was never the same. The light behind his eyes had dimmed, and the effortless persona he had cultivated for decades felt like a heavy lead suit. He didn't want to be under the hot spotlights of the stadium. He wanted to be at his favorite restaurant, La Famiglia, sitting in a quiet booth with a drink and his memories. Frank, being Frank, thought he could fix his friend by dragging him back into the work. He thought the roar of the crowd would cure Dean's depression. He was wrong. From the very first night in Oakland, the tension was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Frank was meticulously rehearsed. Dean was barely present. Dean would forget lyrics, wander off-key, and make jokes that felt more like cries for help than punchlines. The breaking point came in Chicago. The weather was miserable, the schedule was grueling, and Dean had reached his limit. He hated the giant arenas. He hated the smoke and mirrors of the 80s production. He missed the intimacy of a smoky lounge where he could actually see the faces in the front row. One night, after a particularly rough set, Dean simply checked out his hotel, hopped on a private jet, and flew back to Los Angeles without telling a soul. He cited kidney problems as the official reason for his departure, but everyone knew the truth. Dean had quit on Frank. And in Sinatra's world, quitting was the ultimate sin. Frank was livid. He felt Dean had embarrassed him in front of the fans and the industry. He replaced Dean with Liza Minnelli to finish the tour, but the chemistry was gone. For a long time after that, the silence between the two men was deafening. Frank, known for his all-or-nothing loyalty, felt Dean had broken the code. He saw it as a betrayal of their professional legacy. He didn't understand that Dean wasn't trying to hurt him. Dean was just trying to survive the weight of his own grief. This wasn't just a spat over a schedule. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies. Frank believed that the show must go on, even if your heart is breaking. Dean believed that if your heart is breaking, there's no point in pretending otherwise. For several years, the pals became strangers. They lived only a few miles apart in Beverly Hills, yet they occupied different universes. The media ate it up, of course. They painted a picture of two aging titans locked in a bitter feud, a tragic end to the coolest brotherhood in history. It looked like the story of Frank and Dean would end with a slammed door and a cold shoulder. But as the 90s rolled in and the shadows grew longer for both men, the anger began to thaw. Because while Frank Sinatra could hold a grudge better than anyone in Vegas, he couldn't stay mad at the only man who truly understood what it was like to be him. The booze was fake, but the resentment eventually became very real, right up until it didn't matter anymore. The secret softness, while the world thought the two most famous men in Vegas were busy throwing darts at pictures of each other, the reality was much quieter. By the early 1900s, the fiery ego that defined Frank Sinatra began to soften. He realized that holding a grudge against a man who was already half-faded from the world was a hollow victory. He didn't need an apology anymore. He just needed his brother back. The reconciliation didn't happen with a grand public handshake or a joint press conference. It happened in the way old men usually settle things, through whispers and short, heavy phone calls. Frank began reaching out, tentatively at first, checking in on Dean through mutual friends and family. He started hearing reports of Dean's deteriorating state, how he would sit for hours at La Famiglia, staring into space, or how he had almost entirely retreated into a shell of silence. Frank's wife, Barbara, and Dean's ex-wife, Jean, played the roles of diplomats. They knew that if these two were left to their own devices, their pride might keep them apart until the casket closed. But Frank's heart eventually won out over his temper. He began making private visits to Dean's home. These weren't the rowdy, Scotch-soaked nights of the 60s. There were no broads, no brass bands, and no jokes about the Clydes in the audience. Instead, it was just two elderly men sitting in a quiet room in Beverly Hills. According to those close to the family, Frank would sit by Dean's side, sometimes talking about the old days at the Sands, and sometimes just sitting in a comfortable, heavy silence. Dean, who was suffering from emphysema and a broken spirit, didn't have much to say, but he didn't need to. The rat-pack bravado had been stripped away, leaving behind the two boys from a neighborhood who had conquered the world and had nothing left to prove to anyone but each other. There's a particularly moving story about one of their final meetings. Frank, seeing how frail Dean had become, reportedly leaned over and kissed him on the forehead, whispering that he loved him. For a man like Sinatra, who projected an image of untouchable toughness, that gesture was everything. It was a total surrender of the 1988 Together Again anger. He realized that Dean hadn't quit the tour to spite him. Dean had quit the tour because he was tired of being Dean Martin. The public didn't know about these moments. The official narrative was still one of icy distance, which made the ending all the more shocking to fans. Frank was keeping a secret. He was watching his best friend die in slow motion, and it was tearing him apart in a way that no bad review or failed marriage ever could. He was seeing his own mortality reflected in Dean's tired eyes. Even when they weren't together, Frank was obsessive about Dean's well-being. He would call the Martin household constantly, asking, "How's the kid doing?" It was his way of keeping watch. He knew the end was coming, and he was terrified of it. The man who had faced down mob bosses and presidents was completely powerless against the ticking clock of his friend's life. When the call finally came on Christmas morning, 1995, Frank wasn't surprised, but he was destroyed. The peace they had made in private was the only thing keeping him upright. But it wasn't enough to get him to the church. Frank wasn't just missing a friend. He was looking in a mirror and hating the reflection. The real reason by 1995, the man the world knew as the chairman of the board, was effectively a ghost haunting his own legacy. To the public, Frank Sinatra was still the indestructible titan of American song, but behind the gates of his estate, the reality was a heartbreaking tableau of human frailty. When the news broke that Frank would not be attending Dean's funeral, the whispers of a feud were actually a convenient cover for a much more uncomfortable truth. Frank Sinatra was no longer capable of being Frank Sinatra. The primary thief was time, but the accomplice was dementia. In his final years, Frank's legendary steel trap memory began to fail him. This wasn't just forgetting where he put his keys. It was a profound, disorienting fog that would occasionally settle over him, making it difficult to recognize familiar faces or follow complex conversations. For a man who had built a career on precision of a lyric and the sharp timing of a joke, this was a special kind of hell. His wife, Barbara, and his inner circle were fiercely protective, creating a fortress of solitude around him to ensure the public never saw the icon in a state of confusion. Physically, he was just as battered. Frank was dealing with a litany of cardiac issues and respiratory problems that made even short trips a Herculean effort. He was 80 years old, and the decades of Jack Daniels, unfiltered Camels, and high-octane living had finally sent the bill. He was fragile in the literal sense of the word. His bones were brittle, his heart was tired, and his stamina was gone. But the physical decline was only half the story. The emotional blow of Dean's death was a knockout punch that his doctors feared. Frank had always been a mercurial personality, prone to extreme highs and devastating lows. When Dean passed away on Christmas Day, Frank went into a tailspin. He didn't just lose a friend. He lost his most vital connection to the era when they were the kings of the world. The decision for him to skip the funeral was made by a committee of doctors and family members. They knew that if Frank stood at that podium or sat in that pew, The combination of California heat, the crush of the paparazzi, and the raw, unshielded grief of saying goodbye to the kid would likely cause a medical emergency. There was a very real fear that Frank would suffer a stroke or a heart attack right there in the middle of the service. There's also the element of Sinatra's immense pride. Frank lived by a code of image. He never wanted to be seen as weak, and he certainly didn't want the world's final memory of the Sinatra-Martin duo to be a photo of him being helped into a limousine, weeping and confused. By staying away, he was protecting the myth. He was staying in the shadows so that the image of the two of them, young, tan, tuxedoed, and laughing with drink in hand, could remain untarnished. Instead of attending the service at Westwood Village Memorial Park, Frank mourned in the only way he had left, in private, surrounded by his own ghosts. He reportedly spent the day of the funeral in a state of quiet withdrawal. He watched the news reports, saw the crowds, and felt the void. To those in the room, it was clear that a part of Frank had died along with Dean. The chairman was officially retired, not by choice, but by the cruel, slow erosion of his own body and mind. The absence at the funeral wasn't a slight. It was a surrender. Frank was simply too broken to say goodbye in front of an audience. He had given the public everything for 60 years. But this last bit of grief, this final, crushing weight of losing his brother, was something he had to carry alone, in the quiet of his own home, where the cameras couldn't see the tears or the tremors. The Rat Pack was down to its final, flickering light, and Frank knew he didn't have the strength to keep the flame burning much longer. The king of cool to understand why Dean Martin's death hit Frank so hard. You have to understand who Dean actually was. While Frank was a chairman, Dean was the king of cool, a title he earned by looking like the only man on earth who wasn't trying. People often mistake Dean's persona for laziness, but the truth was much more calculated and, in many ways, more impressive. Dean Martin was a man who had mastered the art of being checked out while being the center of the room. Born Dino Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, Dean started out as a guy who didn't even speak English until he was 5. He was a prize fighter, a croupier, and a mob-connected kid who learned early on that if you looked like you didn't care, people couldn't hurt you. This don't give a damn attitude became his superpower when he paired up with Jerry Lewis. He was a straight man, but he was the coolest straight man in history. When he went solo, he became a titan of song and screen, but he did it all with a shrug. The genius of Dean Martin was that he made everything look like a hobby. Whether he was crooning That's Amore or hosting the Dean Martin Show, he acted like he just wandered onto the set looking for a sandwich. He used a teleprompter not because he couldn't memorize lines, but because he didn't want to spend the time doing it. He wanted to be on the golf course. While Frank was obsessing over every note and every lighting cue, Dean was checking his watch to see if he could make his tea time. But this effortless style was also a hiding place. Dean was a deeply private, almost solitary man. Despite the boozy image, which was mostly apple juice in his glass anyway, he wasn't a party animal. He was a guy who liked to go home, eat a bowl of pasta, and watch a movie. He didn't need the validation of a crowd the way Frank did. Frank needed to be loved. Dean just wanted to be comfortable. This fundamental difference is what made their friendship so fascinating. Frank idolized Dean's ease. He wanted to be the guy who didn't care, but he was far too high-strung to ever pull it off. Dean, in turn, respected Frank's power but was never intimidated by it. He was the only person who could call Sinatra Charlie Brown or tell him to shut up when he was being too intense. He provided the balance Frank's life desperately lacked. However, that checked-out nature took a dark turn after his son, Dean Paul, died in 1987. The mask of the king of cool finally cracked, and what was underneath was a man who had simply lost interest in the world. He stopped recording, he stopped filming, and eventually he stopped socializing. The man who had once been the life of every party in Vegas spent his final years sitting in his favorite Italian restaurant, often dining alone or with a small group of family, staring at the walls. He had become a ghost before he even died. He wasn't interested in the legacy, the awards, or the Together Again tours. He had lived a dream, suffered the ultimate nightmare of losing a child, and decided he was done. When the emphysema took hold, he didn't fight it with the ferocity Frank would have. He accepted it with that same trademark shrug. Dean Martin's career was a masterclass in minimalism. He proved that you could conquer the world without ever breaking a sweat, and he showed that the most powerful thing a person can do is walk away when they've had enough. He was the anchor of the Rat Pack, the guy who kept the whole thing from floating away on Frank's ego. When he finally left the stage for good on that Christmas morning, he left a void that no amount of Sinatra's power could fill. Dean had spent his life making it look easy to leave. But for Frank, watching him go was the hardest thing in the world. He was the only man who could make Sinatra feel like a regular guy. And when he left, Frank was just a legend, lonely and cold at the top. The chairman of Dean Martin was the man who wanted to be left alone. Frank Sinatra was the man who wanted to own the world. To understand why Dean's death broke Frank, you have to look at the engine that drove the chairman of the board. Frank Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was an industry, a political force, and a psychological hurricane. While Dean operated on a shrug, Frank operated on will. Everything in Frank's life, from the way he phrased a Gershwin lyric to the way he expected his steak to be cooked, was a matter of life and death. Born in Hoboken, New Jersey, Frank was the only child of an assertive, politically active mother and a quiet, hard-working father. He grew up with a desperate need to be heard and a terrifying fear of being ordinary. By the time he became a Bobby Soxer idol in the 40s, he had already developed the Sinatra doctrine, total control or total chaos. He didn't just want to be a star. He wanted to be the sun around which everything else orbited. Unlike Dean, who treated his talent like a lucky break, Frank treated his voice like a precision instrument. He studied the breathing techniques of swimmers to hold notes longer. He analyzed the bowel movements of violinists to understand how legato a phrase. He was a perfectionist in an imperfect world, which made him both the greatest entertainer of his generation and a nightmare to work for. He was a man of moods. The black dog of depression would sit on his shoulder for weeks, followed by the ring-a-ding-ding highs where he would fly his friends to Monte Carlo on a whim. This intensity defined his career. When he hit rock bottom in the early 50s, losing his voice, his recording contract, and his marriage to Ava Gardner, he didn't just fade away like most stars. He clawed his way backward from here to eternity, won an Oscar, and reinvented himself as the swinging bachelor of the Capitol Records years. He proved he could survive anything, which gave him a sense of immortality that Dean never shared. Frank's obsession with power extended to his social circle. He was a leader of the Rat Pack because he demanded the role. He organized the schedules, he set the dress code, cufflinks were mandatory, and he decided who was in and who was at Clyde. He surrounded himself with a court because he couldn't stand the silence of an empty room. While Dean found peace in solitude, Frank found it terrifying. To Frank, being alone was the same as being forgotten. This is why Dean's withdrawal in the late 80s felt like a personal insult to Frank. In Sinatra's mind, if you had the power to be on, you had a moral obligation to use it. He couldn't wrap his head around Dean's desire to simply quit. For Frank, the chairman, was a title he intended to hold until they nailed a lid on his coffin. He continued to perform well into his late 70s, even when he had to use teleprompters for songs he had sung 10,000 times. He fought the aging process with every fiber of his being, died jobbing his hair and maintaining the tuxedoed silhouette of a man half his age. But underneath the power was a man who felt everything 10 times more than the average person. He was all heart, as his friend said, which meant his capacity for love was just as massive as his capacity for rage. He looked at Dean as the one person he didn't have to boss. Dean was his peer, his equal, and his sanctuary. Dean was the only person who wasn't impressed by the chairman. And ironically, that was the person Frank needed most. As the 90s wore on, Frank's world began to shrink. The friends were dying, the voice was cracking, and the power he had cultivated for decades was useless against the onset of his own decline. He realized too late that the spotlight he had chased his whole life was actually quite lonely. When Dean died, the board was officially dissolved. Frank was still the chairman, but there was no one left in the room to hear the gavel. Frank spent his whole life trying to be the man who had everything, only to realize that the one thing he couldn't buy, command, or sing into existence was one more night with the kid. The Rat Pack mythos, the Rat Pack, wasn't just a group of guys who sang songs and cracked jokes. They were the architects of a specific kind of American cool that hasn't been seen since. They represented a post-war confidence, a cocktail-swigging defiance of the mundane. When you saw Frank, Dean, and Sammy together on stage at the Sands, you weren't just watching a show. You were watching a brotherhood that seemed invincible. They were the guys, W.Ho, had the keys to the city, the best tables in the house, and a secret language that the rest of us were only allowed to overhear. This mythos was built entirely on chemistry. You could put any three talented singers together, but you wouldn't get the Rat Pack. It required Frank's intensity, Sammy's desperate-to-please genius, and most importantly, Dean's nonchalance. Dean was the glue, because he was the only one who didn't seem to care about the hierarchy. In the middle of a high-stakes performance, he'd trip Frank or spill a drink on his tuxedo, and for a split second, the chairman would be humanized. That was the magic. They were icons who acted like teenagers in a locker room. But as the 60s bled into the 70s and 80s, the mythos began to feel the weight of time. The world changed around them. The Beatles happened, Woodstock happened, and the sharp, tailored suits of the Sands began to look like relics. Yet, the public refused to let the dream die. People wanted to believe that somewhere in Vegas, the party was still going on, that the ice was still clinking in the glass, and the jokes were still flying. The loss of Dean Martin was the moment the dream finally collapsed. For decades, even when they weren't working together, the idea of Frank and Dean existed. As long as they were both alive and breathing the same California air, the Rat Pack lived. It was a comforting thought for a generation of fans. The pals were still out there. But when Dean passed away on Christmas Day, the 20th century's version of cool died with him. Frank felt this more than anyone. He knew that without Dean, he wasn't part of a pack anymore. He was just an old man in a big house. The Rat Pack was a shared identity, a collective shield against the world. When Dean left, the shield shattered. It signaled the end of an era where men could be kings of a town, where loyalty was the only law, and where a night out could last for 3 days. The cultural impact of their friendship was so vast that Dean's funeral felt like a state occasion. The fact that Frank wasn't there felt like the ultimate end-of-show signal. It was as if the lights in the casino had finally been turned off, and the janitor was sweeping up the confetti. The myth was over. The era of the Rat Pack had transitioned from a living, breathing thing into a museum exhibit, and Frank, the man who hated nostalgia, was left to curate the memories. They had changed entertainment by making it look like they weren't working at all. They made the audience feel like they were part of the in-crowd. But the tragedy of the mythos is that it was always fueled by the genuine love between the two men at the center. Without Dean to play the foil, Frank's persona became heavy and solemn. The ring-a-ding-ding was gone, replaced by a haunting, lonely silence. The Rat Pack was down to its final, flickering light, and Frank knew he didn't have the strength to keep the flame burning much longer. In the end, Frank Sinatra's absence from Dean Martin's funeral wasn't an act of coldness. It was an act of total, agonizing defeat. For a man who had spent his entire life controlling every room he walked into, the funeral was the one room he couldn't master. He knew that the moment he looked at that casket, the chairman would vanish, leaving behind nothing but a broken 80-year-old man who had lost his North Star. By staying away, he wasn't disrespecting Dean, he was preserving him. He chose to keep the image of the kid alive in his mind, laughing and pouring a drink, rather than confronting the cold reality of a world without him. We now know the truth wasn't found in a tabloid headline about a grudge or a bitter fallout. The truth was written in the medical charts of a fading icon, and the tear-stained private moments of a man who was simply too tired to perform one last time. Frank Sinatra had given the world every ounce of his soul for 6 decades, but he kept his final goodbye for himself. He stayed in the shadows because the sunlight of the Rat Pack era had finally set, and he didn't want the world to see him standing there in the dark. It was the ultimate tragic Sinatra move, doing his way, even when it hurt. 2.5 years later, Frank would follow Dean into the great beyond, finally reuniting the duo that defined a century. They say the lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed when Frank died, but the truth is, the glow had really gone out the day Dean left. Frank just didn't have the heart to tell us until he was gone, too. Are you a fan of both? If you enjoyed this look behind the curtain of Hollywood's greatest brotherhood, don't forget to subscribe for more stories.